Winter had arrived in full force, covering the city with a blanket of biting wind and breaths that turned to steam in the air. The streets were lit by yellow streetlights, their glow reflecting on the damp pavement. The hot dog food truck stood like a small beacon of warmth in the cold, drawing people in search of comfort. The smell of toasted buns and grilling sausages spread through the air, creating a delicious contrast to the chill. For many, that truck wasn't just about the food, it was a refuge. Inside the food truck, the young vendor moved quickly, but not without effort. His hands were red from the cold, trembling slightly as he sliced buns and spread condiments. Despite the difficulties, there was a glint of quiet determination in his eyes. He knew that every hot dog he made meant survival for another day. The wind sneaked in through the gaps in the truck, but he kept going. With every customer he served, a shy smile appeared, as if to say, "Thank you for trusting me." All around, people huddled in heavy coats, walking briskly, but always stealing a glance at the lit-up truck. It was like an impromptu meeting point in the heart of the city. There, strangers shared the same cold and the same desire for something warm. Some people just warmed themselves in the welcoming atmosphere, even without buying anything. It was a small piece of humanity in the middle of the urban rush. Despite being tired, the vendor paid attention to every detail. The ketchup and mustard were neatly aligned, the buns wrapped with care. He had no luxuries to offer, but he offered dedication. Every hot dog seemed to be made with more than just ingredients. There was care in every detail. That's what made his customers come back, even on such freezing nights. The hours passed slowly, marked by the steam rising from the hot grill. The smell of frying onions mixed with the wind, stirring childhood memories in those who passed by. For the vendor, it was just another night of hard work, but for some customers, it was a chance to feel a comforting warmth. In the contrast between the cold and the coziness, an atmosphere was created that nobody would easily forget. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel. This is just the first scene of a story that's going to really move you. If a simple cold night has already touched you, just imagine what's coming next. Hit the notification bell and follow every detail of this transformation. On the other side of the square, a luxurious car pulled to a smooth stop. Its sleek metallic shine was a stark contrast to the simple food truck, drawing the attention of passers-by. Richard, a middle-aged man, elegant in his expensive wool coat, stepped out of the vehicle with firm steps. Beside him, his 8-year-old son Leo walked quietly, observing everything with a child's curiosity. The scene was almost surreal, wealth and innocence standing before the humble warmth of a hot dog truck.
Richard held his son's hand firmly, like someone guiding another through a world he considered his own. His eyes, accustomed to the fast pace of business, quickly fixed on the lit-up food truck. There were no fancy tables or uniformed waiters, just a young worker battling the cold. Richard took a deep breath, trying to hide his discomfort at mixing with the ordinary crowd. For him, this was just a quick stop before returning to his luxurious routine. Leo, on the other hand, was fascinated. His eyes shone with the simplicity of the place, the smell of the food, the heat from the grill, the vendor smiling, even though he was tired. To him, there was no difference between that food truck and an expensive restaurant. Everything seemed magical, different, special. He gently tugged on his father's hand, as if asking for more time to look around. Richard, growing impatient, just quickened his pace. Seeing them approach, the vendor adjusted his apron and tried to compose himself. He didn't see such a distinguished client every day. Even though he had no time for judgments, he immediately noticed the difference between the father and the son. The first had an arrogant look in his eyes, while the second carried sweetness and innocence. That combination sparked a mix of curiosity and wariness in him. When Richard stopped in front of the counter, he didn't order his food politely. He just announced his order in a firm tone, almost like a command. Leo, however, smiled at the vendor and offered a shy "good evening." The contrast between the two was evident even to those standing nearby. Right there, the silent conflict that would forever change all of their lives was beginning. The lit-up food truck cast soft shadows on the wet pavement, creating an almost cinematic atmosphere. The vendor, moving with hurried steps, turned to serve Richard and Leo, forcing a smile despite his exhaustion. His apron was already stained from continuous work, but his eyes still showed dedication. The contrast was striking. On one side, a businessman used to luxury. On the other, a worker fighting for every penny. Richard raised his chin and quickly scanned the simple menu hanging on the truck. There was no sophistication, just basic options described with lettering faded by time. He sighed, as if this moment were a waste of his time, and stated his order in a direct, cold manner. His tone of voice left no room for conversation, as if he were talking to a subordinate. Leo, on the other hand, was enthralled. His eyes wandered over the food truck, watching the shiny grill, the bread toasting, the steam rising in little clouds. For him, it was a spectacle to see someone turn simple ingredients into something that smelled so good and felt so welcoming. He even took a step forward to get a better look, resting his small hands on the cold counter. The vendor noticed the boy's curiosity and offered a warmer smile. "Want to see how I put the sausages on the grill?" he asked in a friendly tone, trying to break the ice. Leo nodded excitedly, while Richard just muttered something about being in a hurry. The contrast between father and son was becoming more and more evident, and even the people waiting in line noticed the difference in their attitudes.
At that moment, a stronger breeze swept across the square, making Leo shrink into his coat. The vendor, noticing the boy's discomfort, moved the cart closer so he could feel the warmth from the grill. It was a small gesture, but one filled with humanity. Leo smiled gratefully, while Richard, indifferent, just kept looking at his watch, impatient to be done with this stop. The vendor began making the hot dog with quick movements, but his hands were shaking from the cold, making each step take longer. He carefully sliced the bun, placed the sausage, and spread the condiments, all done with care. But to Richard, every second felt like an eternity. The man drummed his fingers on the counter, giving stern looks as if he were in a meeting that was running late. Leo watched quietly. For him, there was no rush. The heat coming from the grill and the delicious smell that filled the air were already part of the experience. But he noticed his father's annoyance and shrugged, trying not to draw attention to himself. The vendor, aware of the tension, sped up as much as he could, but the cold was not helping. His stiff hands made every movement slower. "How long are we going to wait for a simple hot dog?" Richard muttered, loud enough for everyone around to hear. His voice was full of contempt and irritation, echoing in the chilly night. A few people in line exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared to intervene. The vendor swallowed hard and continued in silence, as if the words were just another burden to bear. Leo felt his face grow warm with embarrassment. He looked at his father and then at the vendor, seeing the injustice unfolding before his eyes. For a boy of just 8 years old, the situation was confusing, but clear enough for him to understand that something was wrong. He wanted to say something, but his voice was stuck in his throat. Meanwhile, Richard kept grumbling about inefficiency and a lack of professionalism. His tone was arrogant, as if he were lecturing the world. The vendor, with a heavy heart, just kept his eyes down and focused on his work. The atmosphere, once so welcoming, was now filling with tension, setting the stage for the humiliation that was about to happen. Richard lost his patience for good. In a firm voice, dripping with disdain, he raised his tone. "This is ridiculous. A simple hot dog is taking longer than a dinner at a 5-star restaurant." The people around fell silent, turning their attention to the scene. The vendor, his hand still trembling, stopped for a moment, surprised, but soon went back to work, trying to hide his embarrassment. The millionaire couldn't contain himself. This kind of small business never gets anywhere. Inefficient, slow, useless. He pulled his wallet from his pocket and in a cold gesture took out a large bill. "Here, take this, get out of the way, and don't waste any more of my time." His words cut through the air like ice, echoing around the square and leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake.
The vendor felt a heavy weight in his heart. It wasn't the first time he had been humiliated, but there was something especially cruel about being put down in front of so many people. His eyes welled up, but he took a deep breath, refusing to respond. He chose to keep preparing the food because he knew his dignity lay in not returning insult with insult. Leo watched everything, unable to believe what he was seeing. His father, who so often talked about respect and hard work at home, was now looking down on an honest laborer. His small fists clenched inside his coat pockets, and his eyes began to fill with tears. He felt ashamed, not of the vendor, but of his own father. The entire square seemed to have stopped. Some people whispered, while others just watched in silence, waiting to see how the scene would play out. The icy air felt even heavier, as if the cold had taken over not just the night, but Richard's heart as well. After Richard's outburst, the area was taken over by a near suffocating silence. Even the once constant sizzle from the grill seemed to have quieted down. The vendor, instead of reacting, remained silent, lowering his gaze and focusing on finishing the order. His silence, however, spoke louder than 1,000 words. It was the silence of resistance, of a dignity that remains unshaken even in the face of arrogance. A few customers in line exchanged glances, visibly uncomfortable. One woman quietly muttered something about bad manners, but no one had the courage to confront Richard directly. The millionaire stood with his arms crossed, his gaze cold and haughty, as if he had won a battle against an insignificant opponent. But Leo saw no victory. The boy felt a tightness in his chest, as if he himself had been the target of the humiliation. Every one of his father's harsh words seemed to wound his own innocence. He looked at the vendor, who remained steadfast and silent, and felt a mix of admiration and compassion. Richard, impatient, looked at his watch again, ignoring the heavy atmosphere he had created. For him, the episode was just another demonstration of his power, a reminder of his superiority. But deep down, something was beginning to bother him, the sad and disappointed look in his son's eyes, which were fixed on the vendor. The silence, already uncomfortable, became unbearable. It was as if everyone there was waiting for a reaction, a breaking point, something that could restore dignity to the scene. And that moment would not come from the vendor or the customers. It would come from Leo, who was about to gather the courage to say what no adult had the strength to say.
Leo stood motionless for a few more moments, but his heart raced with every beat. His tearful eyes followed the movements of the vendor, who, even while humiliated, maintained his composure. The boy felt something different growing inside him, a mixture of sadness, shame, and courage all rising at once. He knew he had to speak, even if his voice was small against his father's authority. Silence still hung heavy in the air. The vendor, resigned, just took a deep breath as he finished preparing the food. Richard, oblivious to the tension, scrolled through his phone as if nothing had happened. But Leo couldn't take it anymore. The image of the man with red, cold-shaken hands was burned into his mind, right alongside his father's harsh words. He lifted his eyes to Richard, taking in his rigid and arrogant expression. In his mind, the phrases he had heard so often at home were echoing. Hard work is dignity. Respect those who work for a living. A person's value is in their effort. Words that now felt empty, given the actions of the man who had spoken them.
Leo took a deep breath and bit his lip. His small body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the strength he was gathering to confront the man he admired most, who was also the one who had disappointed him most deeply at that moment. He didn't want to fight, he just wanted to be heard. The boy then discreetly wiped away a tear and looked straight at his father. It was a different look, not one of submission or fear, but of someone who wanted to show a greater truth. It was the prelude to the sentence that would change the course of that night and mark the lives of everyone present forever. With a trembling voice and a face wet with tears, Leo finally spoke. "Dad, why are you being so mean?" His tone was soft, but it carried a weight that no adult there could bear. The entire square fell silent again, this time not out of fear of Richard, but from the unexpected power of innocence. Leo pointed discreetly toward the vendor. "He's working all alone, and his hands are freezing. He's doing the best he can." His voice shook, but every word came out clear and direct, impossible to ignore. Richard froze in place, unable to believe what he was hearing. The tears flowed uncontrollably as Leo finished. "Dad, you're the one who said that hard work is dignity, so why are you treating him like this?" The question landed like a thunderclap, echoing not just in Richard's heart, but in the hearts of everyone watching. It was innocence exposing hypocrisy with disarming simplicity. For the first time in a long time, Richard had no answer. The pride that always guided his actions felt small in the face of his son's pure gaze. The silence was now his, and not the vendor's. Shame rose to his face, burning like fire in the cold night air. The vendor, moved, stopped what he was doing and looked at Leo with gratitude. In just a few seconds, that child had said everything he would never have had the courage to express. For everyone present, it was as if the boy had taught a lesson no adult would dare to give. Leo's words echoed in Richard's mind like a relentless hammer. For a moment, the man who was used to being listened to and respected everywhere felt small and vulnerable. He didn't know how to respond, and that unsettled him more than any criticism from business partners or rivals. For the first time, his authority meant nothing when faced with the simple truth from a child.
I hope this translation captures the powerful emotion of your story. If you have more sections you'd like to translate or need any adjustments to the tone, feel free to ask.
The silence in the square was absolute. Every gaze was fixed on him, but Richard could only see his son's tear-filled eyes. It was as if Leo had held up a mirror, showing him exactly what he didn't want to see: his own hypocrisy. The phrases he so often repeated as moral lessons were now turning against him like knives. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The pride that always held him up had now become an unbearable burden. The contrast between his own arrogant posture and the vendor's quiet dignity made the scene even more painful. Richard began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: shame. Leo, his face still wet with tears, didn't look away. He didn't want to hurt his father, but he couldn't ignore what was happening either. For him, speaking up wasn't an act of rebellion, but one of love. He wanted his father to be the man he always claimed to be, someone worthy of admiration. In that moment, Richard realized that if he didn't change, he would lose more than just the respect of others. He would lose the love and trust of his own son, and he knew that loss would be irreparable. Richard stood motionless, his face slightly flushed with shame.
His eyes, once cold and arrogant, were now glistening, though he fought to not show any weakness. The phone in his hand trembled slightly, but he didn't dare move. The weight of the truth Leo had spoken held him trapped, with no way out. The vendor, sensing the tension, stopped preparing the food for a moment. His eyes fixed on Richard, not with anger, but with a quiet compassion. He knew this battle wasn't between the two of them, but within the millionaire's own heart. The square remained silent, and this silence was no longer one of embarrassment, but of expectation. Everyone waited to see how Richard would react. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts, but every attempt to form a response died before it reached his lips. Leo moved a little closer to the counter, as if he wanted to protect the vendor, but also to seek an answer from his father. His fragile yet firm posture was the greatest accusation Richard had ever faced. There was no courtroom, no lawyers, just the voice of a son demanding consistency. And in that instant, Richard understood no amount of money, power, or influence could fix what he had done. Only one true choice remained: to admit his failure and finally learn from the purity of someone who loved him unconditionally.
After long seconds of silence, Richard finally lowered his gaze. His hand, which had once held his wallet as a symbol of power, now trembled slightly. Without a word, he pulled out several bills and placed them on the food truck's counter. The gesture wasn't one of arrogance, but of recognition, almost like a silent plea for forgiveness. The people around them exchanged glances, surprised by the sudden change. The vendor was taken aback and stood still for a few moments, unsure if he should accept the money. But when he noticed the look on the boy's face, he understood that the gesture wasn't just about the money. It was a father's attempt to make things right in front of his son. Richard took a deep breath and for the first time that night spoke in a calm tone. "Please finish the hot dog. I want to pay for it, and for your effort." There was no irony in his voice, only sincerity. Moved, the vendor nodded and finished preparing the food with even more care, now with quiet tears welling in his eyes. Leo watched everything intently. When he saw his father act differently, he felt a wave of relief wash over his young heart. He knew the money couldn't erase the words that had been said, but it represented a first step toward his father becoming a better man. The hot dog was handed over, but nobody cared about the food itself anymore. What was at stake that night was something much bigger: the restoration of dignity, the chance to make things right in front of his son, and the transformative power of an innocent voice. Richard took a deep breath and for the first time that night spoke in a calm tone. "Please finish the hot dog. I want to pay for it, and for your effort." There was no irony in his voice, only sincerity. Moved, the vendor nodded and finished preparing the food with even more care, now with quiet tears welling in his eyes. Leo watched everything intently. When he saw his father act differently, he felt a wave of relief wash over his young heart. He knew the money couldn't erase the words that had been said, but it represented a first step toward his father becoming a better man. The hot dog was handed over, but nobody cared about the food itself anymore. What was at stake that night was something much bigger: the restoration of dignity, the chance to make things right in front of his son, and the transformative power of an innocent voice. Richard handed the hot dog to Leo, but the boy didn't take it right away. Instead, he looked his father in the eyes with an expression that mixed relief and expectation. It was as if he were saying, without words, "Now you've started to become the man I admire." The innocence in his posture contrasted with the weight of the tears that still shimmered on his face. The vendor, deeply moved, watched the scene in silence. No words were needed. Richard's gesture spoke for itself. But it was Leo's reaction that mattered most. For that father, there was no more important audience than the sincere gaze of his son. The dignity he was trying to recover wasn't in the money he had given, but in the chance to win back the trust of that small child. Carefully, Leo took the food from his father's hands and took his first bite. The simple flavor, the lightly toasted bun, the warmth of the sausage, it all seemed more special than any luxurious meal he had ever had. He smiled at the vendor and said with his mouth still full, "It's delicious, sir. Thank you so much." It was a pure thank you that brought quiet tears to the worker's eyes. Richard, for his part, remained silent. What was once pride had now transformed into humility. The man used to controlling million-dollar meetings didn't know how to handle the lesson he had just received from his own son. Instead of feeling diminished, he felt awake, as if he had rediscovered something precious that he had lost along the way. The people in the square, who were still watching the scene, began to disperse slowly, but many of them would carry that image home with them, that of a powerful man, humbled by the weight of the truth, and a boy who with a few words managed to change the course of an entire night. The icy atmosphere of the square seemed warmed by a kind of invisible warmth.
Leo finished chewing and, without hesitation, hugged his father around the waist. His small body pressed against Richard's expensive coat conveyed an indescribable tenderness. "Thank you, Daddy. Now you were fair." The simple sentence hit Richard with the force of a lightning bolt. He felt his eyes well up, but he wasn't ashamed this time. He allowed himself to feel. He allowed himself to be human. The vendor, wordless, discreetly wiped a tear away with the back of his hand. That child had given him something money could never buy: recognition. He wasn't just a man selling snacks to get by. He was a dignified worker, someone whose effort had been seen and valued. It gave him the strength to carry on, no matter how cold the night got. Richard knelt down to get to his son's eye level. He placed his hands on Leo's small shoulders and said quietly, "You showed me what really matters." It wasn't a confession for the onlookers, nor a speech to impress. It was a private acknowledgement, directed at the heart of the person he loved most. And Leo smiled, as if he understood that his father had finally learned the lesson. The hot dog, simple in its essence, became the symbol of that night. It wasn't just food, it was a representation of dignity, respect, and transformation. Every bite Leo took was like a silent confirmation that things could be different from then on. And Richard knew he would never look at that kind of snack the same way again. And so, amid tears, hugs, and the warm steam escaping the food truck, the freezing night was forever marked. The boy would carry in his heart the memory of having taught his father something. The vendor would carry the certainty that his work had value. And Richard would take with him the most important lesson of his life. True power lies not in money, but in the ability to recognize the dignity in every human being. The luxury car moved through the lit-up streets, but the silence inside was deafening. Richard drove with his eyes fixed on the road, while Leo, quiet in the passenger seat, slowly finished his hot dog. With every bite, the boy looked at his father, as if trying to understand what thoughts he was lost in. The sound of the engine was the only noise, contrasting with the silent storm in Richard's heart. The millionaire recalled every detail of the scene: the vendor's trembling hands, the awkward silence in the square, and above all, his son's tears. It was as if every memory was a mirror reflecting his failure. He wondered at what point he had turned into that cold man, so distant from the values he so often preached. His arrogance, once a source of pride, was now an unbearable weight. Leo said nothing, but his pure gaze was enough to keep his father in deep reflection. He knew that if he didn't change, he risked losing something far more valuable than business deals or status: his son's respect. And losing that would mean a void that no amount of money could ever fill. The millionaire's heart, hardened by years of power, was beginning to soften in the face of that simple truth.
Memories of his own childhood surfaced in his mind like ghosts from the past. He saw his own father, a simple man, coming home with calloused hands after long days of work. He never complained. He would just smile and say the hard work was worth it because it supported the family. Richard felt a wave of shame as he compared that image to the man he had become. As he drove, he looked at the workers on the sidewalk, ordinary people braving the cold night. Some carried shopping bags, others pushed hand carts, all driven by the need to make a living. For the first time, Richard truly saw them. They weren't just anonymous faces. They were stories of effort and dignity. And he wondered how many times he had passed by people like them without ever really noticing. After parking in front of the luxurious building where they lived, Richard turned off the car but remained motionless. Leo looked at him in silence, waiting for his father to say something. But no words came, just a deep sigh. Richard knew he didn't have any ready answers. He only had one certainty. He needed to change. He needed to act differently. That night, in his spacious, warm bedroom, Richard lay down on the soft bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The cold from the square seemed to have seeped into his soul, reminding him that real warmth didn't come from luxury, but from his actions. The vendor's silence and Leo's tears were like constant echoes that wouldn't leave him in peace. He closed his eyes and saw the scene again. His young son standing up to him in front of everyone, defending a stranger. Leo's courage was a painful contrast to his own cowardice. It made him feel small, but at the same time, it sparked in him a desire to be better. Tossing in bed, Richard stared at the ceiling and whispered to himself, "It's not enough to just give money. I need to do more. I need to make this right." The idea began to take shape in his mind, like a small flame igniting in the dark. This wasn't about philanthropy or public image. It was about regaining the dignity he had lost in his son's eyes. And so, the night passed without sleep, with Richard reflecting on choices, values, and consequences. By the time morning came, he had made a decision. He would go back to the square. Not to buy a snack, not to hand out charity, but to start over. That cold night had planted within him the seed of an inevitable transformation. The next morning, Richard canceled important meetings and asked his driver to take him to the square. The luxury car once again parked in front of the food truck, but the man who stepped out was not the same one from the night before. His posture was different, less arrogant, more human. Passers-by noticed the scene with curiosity, unable to imagine what was about to happen. The vendor, still battling the cold, nearly dropped a bun when he saw Richard approaching. His heart raced, perhaps expecting another humiliation. But this time, the millionaire's eyes held no contempt. There was something unexpected in them. Humility. Richard took off his hat as a sign of respect, a small gesture, but one filled with profound meaning.
"I've come to apologize," Richard said, without any pretense. His voice held no arrogance, only sincerity. "The other night, I was wrong. I failed you, and I failed my son. What I did was wrong." Silence hung in the air for a few seconds, until the surprised vendor simply nodded, still unsure how to react. Richard took a deep breath and continued, "I know words aren't enough. I was raised being told that hard work is dignity, and that night I forgot that. But my son reminded me. I don't just want to apologize, I want to make things right." With every sentence, he seemed to shed layers of pride, revealing a vulnerable man, but one who was determined to change. The vendor tried to smile, but his eyes welled up with quiet tears. He had never imagined that an arrogant customer would come back to make amends, let alone a millionaire. The square was beginning to take notice, as a few people stopped to listen. The contrast between this scene and the previous one was striking. Then Richard took the unexpected step. "I don't just want to buy your food. I want to invest in your work. You don't need a handout, you need an opportunity, and I can offer you that." He spoke with firmness, but without his former haughtiness. It was as if the power he once used to humiliate was now being put to use to build something. The vendor was silent for a few moments, processing the words. His tearful eyes reflected surprise and gratitude. Finally, he extended his hand and said, his voice choked with emotion, "If you truly believe in me, then I accept, but not as charity, as a partnership." The sentence drew murmurs of approval from the people around them. Richard gave a genuine smile, shaking the young man's hand firmly. "Partnership," he repeated. In that moment, they were no longer a millionaire and a vendor. They were two men, different in origin, but united by the value of hard work and the courage to start over. Leo, who had accompanied his father, watched the scene with a quiet but proud smile. He knew this change hadn't happened by chance, but because he'd had the courage to speak the truth. For him, seeing his father shake the vendor's hand was proof that his innocence had transformed something important. And so, in that cold square, before curious and emotional onlookers, a new story began. The food truck would no longer be just a place of business. It would become a symbol of dignity, effort, and also redemption. Richard, with Leo by his side, was taking the first steps in a transformation that would change not only the vendor's life, but his own. The following days were marked by rapid and visible changes. The food truck, which once seemed fragile against the cold, received new equipment, a fresh coat of paint, and a team of helpers. The vendor, who used to spend nights alone battling the icy wind, now had support to serve his customers with greater ease. The simple cart was transformed into a bustling spot, a symbol of hope for everyone who passed through the square. Richard was closely involved every step of the way. He didn't just want to invest money, he wanted to be present. He arrived early to check on the improvements, discussed ideas for growth with the vendor, and even listened to customers to understand how to make the business even better. For the first time in years, he felt he was part of something that wasn't centered on profit, but on dignity.
I hope this translation captures the spirit and emotional depth of your story. If you have more sections or need any adjustments, feel free to ask.
Leo was thrilled with every visit. His eyes would light up seeing his father helping without arrogance, talking with ordinary people, and treating the vendor as an equal. For the boy, this was more valuable than any expensive toy or luxurious trip. It was his father finally becoming the man he always claimed to be. A real example, not just empty words. The vendor, deeply moved, expressed his gratitude whenever he could. "You changed my life," he would say quietly, but Richard would respond with a sincere smile. "Actually, it was my son who changed mine." As he said this, he would look at Leo, who beamed with pride. Each time he repeated that phrase, he felt he was making amends not just with the vendor, but with himself. Over time, the food truck expanded into a small network of carts spread across the city. Each one carried not just the brand's name, but also a story of overcoming adversity and respect. When customers discovered the origin of this growth, they became loyal not just for the taste, but for the meaning behind every hot dog served. Richard realized that his life, once focused solely on multi-million-dollar deals, had gained a new dimension. Investing in something simple, yet genuine, brought him a satisfaction that no multi-million-dollar contract had ever provided. He learned that the real return wasn't in the profits, but in the positive impact his actions had on the people around him. Leo, still a child, understood the significance of what had happened. He knew it wasn't common for a father to change so much because of a simple question. This filled him with pride and reinforced his belief that the truth, when spoken with love, could transform even the hardest of hearts. For Leo, that was the greatest gift he had ever received. The vendor, now Richard's business partner, made sure to keep the spirit of that night alive. Every employee hired received not just training, but also a lesson to respect the customer and value the effort of every worker. What was once just about survival had become a life mission, and this spirit infected everyone around them. In the square, which had been the stage for the humiliation, A new atmosphere now prevailed. Where there was once an awkward silence, there was now laughter, the smell of fresh food, and a feeling of community. The transformation of the place reflected the transformation of the people involved. It was as if that spot had stopped being just a hot dog cart and had become a symbol of dignity and change. And so, in that cold city, one simple winter night changed destinies. A millionaire rediscovered humility, a vendor found opportunity, and a child proved that truth can be more powerful than any fortune. The cold still cut through the streets, but inside the hearts of those who lived this story, there was a lasting warmth, that of dignity, respect, and transformation. So do you also believe that a simple action can change destinies? This story proved that dignity and respect are worth more than any fortune. So don't leave without subscribing. We have many other moving stories like this one that will touch your heart and make you reflect on life. Click subscribe now and join our community of people who believe in the power of stories.